Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much for coming. It's my pleasure to be here at the University of Heinrich Heine. I'm very grateful to the organizers of this event, and I hope I shan't disappoint your expectations. I'm going to talk today on the Anglo-Saxon charters, and I couldn't find a better name than just the dynamics of production. And I'll try to entertain you a bit because the topic is not very familiar. Could you please? You're actually going to have to do this quite a lot. Yeah. So I'll try to show you lots of data, lots of pictures, and try to make it in an amusing way. Yeah. It's going to fly. Yes. One more, please. Don't you have the switcher now? One more. Yep. First of all, I'd like to talk about the editions. Andres, eyes up here. Thank you. First, we have the Campbell edition, which is quite old, but we're still much in debt to John Campbell because he was the first editor who was organizing the first academic edition of the Anglo-Saxon charters. It came in 6 volumes, but unfortunately, the source critique was not his strongest part. So we have the newer edition, which is Sir Walter de Grey Birch, who edited the Cartularium Saxonicum, and this is a much finer edition. It's also available online. Unfortunately, again, it doesn't stand up to today's standards. Thank you. Then nowadays we have the edition by Peter Sawyer. This is not the edition of the charters themselves. This is just a list, but Professor Sawyer annotated on it. He commented on it heavily, spoke on the provenance, on the authenticity, on the current location, and so forth. So it's a starting point for any discussion of the Anglo-Saxon diplomatics. And nowadays, luckily, we've got the digital edition of Electronic Sawyer, which looks like that. I encourage you to visit their website. It's available. It's open source. It contains 99.9% of all the texts. Unfortunately, not all volumes have been published yet, so you cannot always refer to a specific volume. Thank you. Another one. A little overview of the source. It's supposed that the charters were first introduced in England with the advent of Christianity, so it should be roughly at the beginning of the 7th century. The problem, however, is that the earliest extant charter comes from 679, and there's a huge debate whether the charters came later than the advent of Christianity or not. Then the majority of the sources, the majority of the charters have been preserved in later copies. For example, here you can see a nice reproduction of a cartularium from the 13th century. You can see the script is Gothic already. Another one, please. The diplomas, the charters, the writs, all together, they were produced very unevenly throughout the period. This is a diagram from an atlas produced by David Hill. It still holds up, and you can see that there's this huge peak in the middle of the 10th century, and you can see we virtually have none from the 7th century. So we have those alleged charters, but which could be spurious, could be authentic, and then we have this uneven distribution. As of now, we have almost 1,900 known charters. There might be more coming, but it's very unlikely because I think the work has been very productive. The typology can be multifold. You can discriminate. You can sort them depending on the language, depending on the provenance, depending on the archive, depending on the type of the document, whether it's a land charter, whether it's a writ. So I propose a simplified version. First of all, we've got the diplomas, and for example, here's a diploma from mid-9th century, very lovely reproduction. Then we've got the Anglo-Saxon writs, The writ is very different from a diploma. For one thing, it's mostly written in vernacular. For the other thing, it has an appended seal. This is, for example, a sealed writ from around the mid of the 11th century. And finally, we have about a half of our documents could be classified as miscellaneous sources. For example, this is the opening page of the last will of King Ethelred. It's again written. They can be written both in Latin and in English. They can be some fragmentary boundaries, basically anything. Suits and land disputes, manifold. I will be talking about the diplomas, and when I say a charter, I would usually refer to a diploma unless I specify that I'm talking about something else. Thank you. A very brief overview of how these sources were structured. They're very consistent in their organization. First of all, we've got the invocatio. I put some typical formulae that would open invocatio. Then we've got the proem. For example, the king, the monarch, would explain why he's giving this land or this estate to a certain grantee. Usually they're highly formulaic, and you can rarely find any actual information. But sometimes there's also quite interesting information, such as, for example, the price. Sometimes people paid to get an estate. Sometimes you can read that this man or this thane was the second generation in service. So sometimes there are bits here and there. Then we've got the narratio, that is the main body, which is highly technical. This is this land of 20 mancos, 20 hides in that place, which is in vernacular called that and that, very technical. Then we've got the anathema. I don't think I need to explain what that is. Then we've got the boundaries. They're usually in Old English, which is why the English scholars had the opportunity to identify 99.5% of the estates on the map as early as the 19th century. Then we've got the eschatological, and that is the witness lists and the date. Sometimes they can be absent, which brings us to the question of how do we know if that's an authentic charter or not. But for the most part, they are appended at the end. Right. Now I will have to give you a little overview of the period. I'm gonna talk about the 10th and 11th century, and because I know that the Anglo-Saxon material is not very familiar, let's just say, especially in its details, I will have to simplify and give you a 2-minute overview of how it happened. To make it easier for you, I will try to add some humor to it so that you remember the names and the figures of the kings. So first of all, we begin the 9th century with the joint rule of Ethelred and Edward the Elder. Contrary to what you might have thought, they are not a couple, they are siblings. Next one, please. The next king was King Ethelstone, please. I'm sorry, I'll just give you a brief overview of what was happening during these 25 years. So Alfred the Great managed to secure Wessex from the Danes. Ethelfled ruled in Mercia, which is why she was called the Lady of the Mercians. Edward was ruling first Wessex. After her death, he was ruling both Mercia and Wessex. And he already started the expansion towards the former kingdom of East Anglia and this borderland with Cambridgeshire, London, and others. Next one, please. Then we've got King Ethelstone, who is he is the son of King Edward, who is best known for winning the Battle of Brunanburg, or Brunanburg, depending on how you pronounce it. We don't know where it happened, but it happened in 937. We've got an Anglo-Saxon poem telling us the story of this fight. It was a coalition of the Celtic and Viking lords against the one and righteous king of the English. That is King Ethelstone. Then we've got this chap with a fan or gramophone, I'm not sure, King Edmund. He was also the son of King Edward the Elder, but from another wife. He is best known for being murdered at his own feast, 6 years after he was consecrated king. The next king was King Ethelred, who was quite sickly. So this graciously crossing leg guy was also the son of King Edward, so it was a long generation. Surprisingly enough, both Edward and Edmund died quite early. So Edmund was about 27. Edmund was 27, and Edward was about 31 or something. Next one, please. The next, in their reign, what happened basically? Wessex, with its dependencies in form of Mercia, appended all of East Anglia, all of the 5 borough district, and later under King Edward they annexed the Kingdom of York. And so from then on we can speak of a united English kingdom, even though it's a historiographical phantom. Of course, no one called it the United Kingdom of Mercia, Wessex, and so forth. Next one, please. Then came King Edward, or Edwig, depending on how you pronounce him, who's best known for his indecent behavior at his own marriage. He was, at least according to later sources, which were quite biased against him, he was trying to arrange a threesome after his marriage with his new wife and her mum. But Saint Dunstan was trying to drag the young king from this affair. So he was quite a scandalous person, but again, the sources are highly biased. Then we've got King Edgar. So this neck-breaking chap was another son of King Edward, and he was a little younger than Edwig. They were sons of the same mother, and Edwig was originally crowned king of the United... I can't go around this phrase, the United Kingdom. But 2 years afterwards, the nobility in Mercia rebelled, and they elected Edgar as their king. And so we've got a joint rule again. The situation was very heated, and if Edwig lived longer, it is not improbable that there might have been a civil war. Edgar is best known for being consecrated king of the English this time on the River Dee, where supposedly 8 British monarchs, that is Celtic princes or whoever they were rowing in his barge. So he was quite an imposing king. Then came Edward the Martyr, who's best known for being killed at his brother's estate. Next one, please. This is a nice Victorian-style picture of, this is the supposed murderer. You can see a little knife here. So he was stabbed in the back. And from him we have just a few charters. Then came King Ethelred then Ready, who is best known for losing basically all the wars against the Vikings. Can you please press it 4 times? This is how it was happening over the time, so which resulted in another dynasty coming to the English throne, the dynasty of the Danish king, King Canute, and his 2 sons Harold and Harthacnut. So this frowny guy is the great king of Denmark. He's actually called Knud den Store, Canute the Great, and he quite was. And he's best known for ruling a so-called Northern Empire, which united England, Denmark, Norway, and part of Sweden. But unfortunately, the empire collapsed after his death. And finally, we've got King Edward the Confessor, who's best known for being a nincompoop and dying without an heir, which led to the Norman conquest. That's about how it happened. So now we've got an overview of what we're dealing with. I have to put a special emphasis on these circumstances, because I think it's impossible to understand the production of the charters when you look at them aside from the political situation and the, for example, the inner relations in the family. So this is how it altogether looks. It's a very simplified family tree. There were many more Aethelingers, the princes and the princesses. So it's a very brief overview. Next one, please. Right. So what I propose doing is that we'll look at the charters both as the political and no, that was not the plan. We'll look at them as both acts of political and cultural agenda, because as you have seen, they were quite formulaic, but at the same time, the formulas varied from time to time, which led me to this conclusion that we'll need to look at them in both perspectives. So first, we're going to look at Edward the Elder. So he supposedly was trying to claim the Mercian heritage. In Mercia, the greatest writer was Eldhelm, and King Alfred and his son were trying to incorporate the language of the Mercian charters into their own charters, because the West Saxon charters prior to King Alfred, the father of King Edward, were quite technical. Next one, please. So there's even a term, Adhelmian language. Next one, please. And again, I'm not going to read the list. You can look at it yourselves. I'll just point out that this style is both very formulaic, but at the same time very difficult and very flamboyant. I dare say it's very hard to read. Next one, please. It is supposed that Edward and his father were using the style to claim the Mercian heritage since they appended Mercia, since they annexed Mercia to their kingdoms. They secured it from the Danes. The next king would be our book-reading Ethelstone, and we know that he was brother-in-law of Emperor Otto the Great. His half-sister was married to the emperor, and it's not sure if he was trying to assume it from the imperial court, but it's definitely his intention to present himself as an emperor, even though this title was perhaps not used in the vernacular sources. In the written sources, however, it was used quite often as much as the titles of Basileus, Imperator, Propugnator, Gubernator, Defensor, and everything else they could find. Surprisingly enough, Ethelstone did not enjoy the unanimous approval of his policy. He was first elected again by the Mercian nobility because he was raised at the Mercian court, and so he was, so to speak, at odds with the ecclesiastical establishment in Wessex, which is why, apart from one charter, there's no donations from him to the Winchester community, which is very strange. Next one, please. It is not inconceivable that Ethelstone, putting himself against these people of establishment, was trying to create a sort of administration that he could rely on, and this administration was to be the lay elite, partly what I'm studying in my project, the things or the ministers of the king who were working as his agents in the provinces. Next one, please. His style was very flamboyant, and the most known scribe is called Ethelstone A. We do not know if it was one person, if it was an agency. Most scholars believe it was just one scribe. But anyway, if you take an iconic Anglo-Saxon charter, that would be Ethelstone A. Next one, please. This is what it would have looked like. As you can see, these charters are rather long. They usually account to about 300 words, and you can see that the witness lists are very, very, very long. Most of these people are those named Thanes, people who the king was relying upon in ruling the kingdom. Actually, I think it was Ethelstone who held the record of having the record of Thanes overall. Other kings would usually employ maximum up to 50 Thanes at their councils. Ethelstone could have more than 100. Next one, please. Then we've got those two, the gramophone king and the cross-legging king, Edmund and Edgar. Next one, please. Sorry. Next one, please. They were not as strong rulers. Ben Snook refers to them. Their time in power was wrecked by political instability, fractionalism at the court, and moral impropriety. Next one, please. The court was dominated by the so-called ecclesiastical party. The three most prominent figures were Bishop Oda, Abbot, and later Archbishop Dunstan, and Bishop Kenwald, or Coenwald in the West Saxon pronunciation. And it seems like they were pushing the monarchs aside from the government, which is not surprising because, for example, King Ethelred spent most of his time ruling from his bed because he was very sick. So quite explicable. Next one, please. And we can see three diplomatic styles in their reign. the so-called mainstream, the alliterative charters, and Dunstan B. Dunstan B is associated with, you guess it, Dunstan. The alliterative charters are very interesting themselves. There are not many. There are maybe about 15 of them, and they are not pieces of poetry, but they are very outstanding. They're standing out from the main corpus. Next one, please. The language became rather simplistic, though it was not crude, not at all. And the party, the ecclesiastical party, was, it seems, exploiting their position at the court. They were referring to themselves with very, again, flamboyant and quite flattering titles like the High Bishop of whatever I want. Next one, please. Whereas the kings were just kings. Next one, please. This is, for example, what a charter from 948 would have looked like. You can see they're shorter. The witness lists are much shorter, and if you could read it, if you had more time, you could. I could assure you that the styles are rather simple. By the way, speaking of the structure, you can see that this, for example, are the boundaries. You can see that the script is a bit different. Here you have the Latin script, the Latin language, and here it's in vernacular. Next one, please. Then comes our King Edwig with his threesome. It seems Edwig was trying to put an end to this chaos of the ecclesiastical rules, so it seems that he disbanded the previous chancery and employed a new set of scribes. Next one, please. He was reshuffling the priorities in his formula. Next one, please. For example, he would refer to himself, I mean, not he himself, the scribe would refer to the king, for example, as Ego Edwig Rex Anglorum hoc donum cum triumpho sancta crucis impressi, whereas order would be just Ego Order Archiepiscopus consignari. And this is said to be not just a coincidence. This is said to be the reflection of the inner politics at the court. Next one, please. Edwig's charters employed lots of Grecisms, such as Basileus, but not only. Next one, please. And the charter would look like this. Unfortunately, this is not the finest reproduction I've got. And unfortunately, it's not the prime example because usually they're longer. But nevertheless, you can see the fine crosses over here, the shorter versions of the witness lists. Yes, next one, please. Then comes our neck-breaking King Edgar. King Edgar was a very different man from King Edwig. He was also very young. It was maybe 1 or 2 years younger than Edwig, but he was trying to balance out the parties at his court. Next one, please. The most prominent styles are in number 4. Next one, please. We've got these. I'm not sure if the names would tell you anything, but believe me, they are very distinct from each other, which is said to be the reflection of Edgar's inner ideas of how his court should have worked. He was trying to balance out all parties at the court. We've got a party of Dunstan, we've got the party of we can call them lay scribes, the mainstream charters, and so forth. But as the events after the death of the king showed, this was only possible as long as the king lived. Right after his death, the old dogs under the carpet ran away and had a squabble among themselves. It's very interesting to note that the language of the charters becomes simplistic again, whereas the ecclesiastical sources use the so-called hermeneutic style, and it's very difficult to read. It's the finest Latin you can find in the British Isles at the time. And Ben Snook, whose work I'm using a lot in this presentation, asserts that this was again the reflection of how the bishops saw their position. We can write some technicalities for those having powers, but we are the establishment. So the style should belong to us, and those should just have some bureaucratic procedures. Thank you. Next one. The charter that I took this picture from is actually a miniature, which is not a book, but this is not how it's supposed to. Which is not a book, but it is an opening page from one of the charters where King Edgar founded the new minster. Next came King Ethelred, the unready king, the ill-counseled. Next one, please. So, very much as his name is offering us an explanation of his rulership, it seems he had very bad choice of counselors. His court was dominated by at least 3 parties, but in fact there are more sub-parties in these periods. We've got the lay party, we've got the ecclesiastic party, and we've got one figure who outweighed his colleagues, so to speak, the infamous Ealdorman Edric Struona. His byname can be translated as the greedy one, which says a lot about Ethelred's choice of his entourage. Next one, please. This led to a full chaos in the tenures, because the lay party was expropriating the lands that King Edgar gave to the monasteries and to the church. Later on, when King Ethelred became of age, he atoned for his sins, as he himself wrote in his charters, and he was redistributing them again. Then came Edric Struona, and he was trying to provide for his own family. So you can imagine what kind of chaos that was, especially given the circumstances of the reign, that is, the Vikings. So that was a full havoc in those 30 years. Next one, please. And in the formulas, for the first time, we find a very mundane explanation of why the king is donating this or that land to that or that grantee. Usually, the king explains that this land was unjustly appropriated by some layman who had no right for this land in the first place, and I'm now giving it to the monastery, and then begins the proem for the salvation of my soul, and so forth, so forth. Later on, the charters from 1990s and from 990s and thenceforth included the nullification of the previous title deeds, because it is assumed that there were many charters extant for one and the same estate. Go figure who has the right. Next one, please. And a charter would look like. Thank you. A charter would look like that. Again, you can see that they are longer. The witness lists are again longer, but the majority of the space is occupied by the reasons of why the king is giving this or that land to that or the other favorite of his. Next one, please. Then came King Canute. King Canute was from a different dynasty, and so it is said that he did not need this justification, because, as Charles Inslee put it, the West Saxon monarchy was trying to trick the nobility, that it was like a kind of a propaganda. The patronage of the monastic houses was a sort of royal policy, whereas King Canute, who himself was Christian but came from a pagan family, perhaps did not feel that sympathetic with the church. I mean, he felt sympathetic with the church in terms of supporting it, but he was not very keen on giving the church the land. Next one, please. On the other hand, I am speculating that it might have been due to the fact that there were no available estates. Just for that reason, because if you can imagine, if the previous 100 years were filled with the grants, probably there were not enough estates left. Next one, please. Nevertheless, he had about 44 charters, which would look like that, and we can see that he fully assumed the position of an English monarch. Next one, please. And finally, we've got Edward the Confessor. Edward had allegedly 66 charters issued. The majority of them are forgeries, later forgeries. Instead, we have a huge number of writs, which were a very different type of document. Next one, please. Maybe his chancery had some influence from Normandy, where he lived his younger years. Next one, please. It has been argued that it might have been due to the fact that the king was relying on the writs and not on the charters that we see this decline. But I'm also speculating that it might have been that we do not have the charters preserved in the archives, for a reason I could comment on in the discussion section. Next one, please. This is what a writ would look like. You can see that it's a different script. It's in Old English, and it's much, much shorter. Next one, please. And finally, in the 3 minutes I've got left, I want to talk about the statistics, because I think it's the strongest side of my project in this respect. First of all, this is this. I'm sorry for the Cyrillics here. I didn't have the opportunity to change it. But here's the dynamics of the production of the charters of the donations of lands from the year 900 to around 1060, but 1066 actually. You can see the peak in King Edwy's reign. The red line is the donation in favor of the Thanes, of whom I talked 2 years ago. Then we've got the donations in favor of the church, this green one, and everyone else goes in the blue line. Next one, please. And I have too many questions. I don't have the answers. For example, why is it so? Does it reflect the inner politics of the court? Does it reflect the social realities? Is it economy? Why? Next one, please. Then the major question, of course, is whether our corpus is representative or not. Then we've got the geographical distribution. This is a table I put together for another presentation earlier this year. We can see that the donations are concentrated primarily in Wessex. The Thanes had 68%, the church had only a half, but unfortunately too many church charters are of disputed authenticity. If you add up the disputed ones, you would have roughly the same numbers, and so forth. Why is that? To show it on the map, the majority of the donations were concentrated here. Why not there? That's a good question that I do not have an answer to yet. Does it reflect any sociological, any social, any economical, or any political realities? Was it that the kings did not own the estates east of this borderline? Was it due to the fact that the local aristocracy would not allow to give out so much land? I do not know. Next one, please.
I've got a couple of fairly short questions, mostly for clarification. The additions you were talking about at the start, are they relatively comprehensive, or are they quite outdated now, as there has much more material surfaced between those?
Mm-hmm.
And also, how have these manuscripts and documents come to us?
Mm-hmm.
Are they from sort of a single collection?
Mm-hmm.
Are they from lots of different collections? They've just been found all over the place. Like, might that be part of the explanation as to why some are more creative than others? And I was actually really curious about the titles that, particularly that Ethelstone was claiming he was the Imperator and the Defender and the Basilius. Did anyone else ever call him these things?
Mm-hmm. Good question.
Like, do any letters to other foreign dignitaries ever refer to him as the Imperator, or was that seen as probably an unwise move?
Mm-hmm. Should I collect the questions or answer straight? First, on the editions, the modern editions we have at hand are quite comprehensible. I only show the, so to speak, the milestones. The newer series was conceived in 1973. They have been published, I think, 20 volumes right now. They are now published by archives. So we've got, for example, the Burton archive, the Winchester archive, and so forth. But it's far from conclusion. The electronic story is very comprehensible, so it is easy to work with them, especially with the website. Speaking of the titles, from my knowledge, I cannot recall anyone else calling them these fancy titles. Maybe you can find some references in the correspondence with the papal court, but I doubt it. In the English sources, for example, the monarchs were usually referred to as just kings. But Ben Snook, whose work I'm using here in my own presentation, says that the charters were read aloud in front of the big audience, as I said, at least 100 people at the court simultaneously, and people were probably, maybe it rang the bell, so to speak. And the second question was?
How the manuscripts come.
Oh yes, well that's a painful topic, because if you ever see the Queen, tell her thank you very much for Henry VIII, who disbanded the monasteries, because the charters were preserved in the monastic archives. They were, for the most part, they were copies in the cartularies, and we do not know how many have perished. Simon Keynes, a huge authority on the topic, says very cautiously that we might have about 10% of what has ever been produced, but there is no guarantee. I myself am going to use the Doomsday Book to try to compare a snapshot with the dynamics. But can this explain the dynamics? Yes, I think it has some certain hand in this gunpowder barrel, but I cannot say how much.
Yes.
Thank you for this presentation. This question for clarification. If I get right, you were underlining the variation in the style of writing from one king to the other, and at one point, at least when you were speaking of Edgar, you were saying, well, there were different scribes, and they represent different parties. So the idea that the language you use represents also a political situation, a political point of view. So I was curious to know if I get it right. And second, how was the relationship between those who decide the line and the scribe that put down the document in practical terms? And the second is somehow related, because you pointed out this transformation in language and style, and I was wondering if there are other aspects that change in the production of the physical document, the material, because from this overview you touched just one type of document, and it seems that only with Edward the Confessor there is the transition from one type of charter. At the first look, they look quite the same in terms of dimension and position of the material on the page, so there was a sense of continuity from one king to the other. Also was a bit surprised with also Canute, that seems to apply, so probably using the same entourage of scribes for English things. So if you can say something more on that.
I will have to come back to many of your questions later in this discussion. First of all, the relationship between the scribe and the author of the charter, we do not know what it was. We do not know how it was organized. We can compare it to, for example, some procedures known from the Carolingian world, where a bishop would dictate to a corpus of scribes, sometimes parallel documents, but we have no clue. We don't even have the word chancellor. So there's a huge argument whether the office of a chancellor ever existed. There's one chancellor mentioned under King Edward the Confessor, but it's definitely a foreigner whom he brought with him from Normandy. So there's a huge. We can reconstruct the chancery and the office and the relationship in this office only from the secondary material, from the educated guess that we can draw from the charters themselves. Again, Ben Snook had a very wonderful metaphor. He said he wished he could know if Ethelstone and Ethelstone A, the scribe, actually ever sat on the bench at the cup of ale discussing how to formulate another donation. But it's just an educated guess of how it might have been. The question of the physical dimensions and so forth, as I said, and as you yourself mentioned, they're very monolithic in terms of paper, parchment, dimensions, folding, and so forth, which is another question of why this kind of very archaic document persisted for so long. Why was it not changed earlier? Because it was quite cumbersome in the process of governing. It was quite cumbersome. the diplomas do not change in their, neither in their composition nor in the dimensions, apart from maybe the script. You can see the change from the earlier script to the later script. The other types of documents, for example, the writs, it's supposed that they were derived from the charters, because the charters were the diplomas were the first charters imported into England. But we do not know how people saw it themselves. We know that, for example, the writs were quite small. They were strips of parchment. They were rolled together, and they had a seal appended to them. And the parchment was folded that way that you cannot unfold it again, and so that no one will see that you've read the writ. And so it's a big question of why the writs were not employed before Canute. There's again a huge debate whether they were used as far back as King Alfred's time. There's a vague reference to them, but the earliest writs we have are from Ethelred and Ready, and their provenance is disputed. There were more questions?
No.
Okay, sorry. We can discuss this at the coffee break.
Yeah, thank you. As we just saw yesterday, charters are not pure text bearers, text transporters, but they perform authority and power in themselves, in their materiality, in the scripture, in the layout, in the monogramma, in the seal, and so forth. We didn't speak about language, and so I was struck, as Mr. Riccon, by this kind of language policy in the Anglo-Saxon charters. What do you think about the How do you think about the motives? If the Chancery or Ethelstone personally introduces an old language of the flourishing times of Althel, that means a very complicated, sophisticated language which nobody could understand. Was this a kind of power policy, the authority of language, but the successor changed policy into a simple style? It was very, very interesting, I think, but the motives of that.
Yeah.
And second, to your questions, I think that the change, the decline of diplomas and the rise of writs prefigures the tendency of English bureaucracy and administration, where the writs became the most important instrument of royal administration. And the gifts, the grants of land, you can't only give and grant where you have something to give. And maybe that the concentration results from concentration of royal property.
Should I add anything?
Language policy.
Language policy, yes.
Is it a policy or?
Again, as I said, you cannot separate the king or the person of the persona of the monarch and their documents, because we know that Ethelstone was a quite authoritative ruler. He might be connected to the murder of his half-brother, who was king for 17 days, but there's no proof. He seems to be a very I am the ruler here guy. And so we do understand that this was not a coincidence that in his charters we have this style. King Alfred first employed Elhelmian style because he, as far as we can reconstruct, and we have far more documents, far more personal attitudes from King Alfred's time in his, for example, in his preface to the translations. He himself saw himself as a renovator of the olden days, of the golden age, which was assumed to be before the Vikings ever came. And since in that time Elthelm was the flower of the English nation in these terms, naturally Alfred used this kind of style. Edward used it as much, but for other reasons, and Ethelstone had nothing else at hand, basically. As for his successors, it seems that they were just weaker rulers, and the parties at the court simply kind of took the strings of government in their own hands. And maybe they were not as educated as Ethelstone. As far as we know, Ethelstone was quite educated for his time. And he was a very prominent figure, being authoritative, a fearsome warrior who led the army in battle himself, and at the same time a very cultured person. And an ideal absolute monarch, so to speak. Yes.
Yeah, that sounds very promising.
There's been recently published his biography by Sarah Foote from early 2000s, as far as I remember. Yes.
Professor Moscoponi?
Yeah. I'd like to know, first of all, if you yourself found any important data for your project while studying the document in its materiality compared to the editions you mentioned. I'm coming back to the questions of yesterday or for yesterday from the lecture of Professor Wojcieł.
Mm-hmm.
Did you find any, precise data from the layout of the chapter?
Yes, thank you for the question. It's quite relevant for my project. I myself do not work, for example, with the language. I use it. I quote other works simply because you cannot leave it out. But I myself, first of all, concentrate on the statistical data. And I do receive lots of thought-provoking input. For example, as Mr. Del Corno mentioned, and as it was also mentioned later, it might have been that the writs simply superseded the charters, but I myself think that I want to look at the Doomsday Book, which is this thick, and it will take another year of my life, and maybe one of my kidneys. But I want to look, for example, how many donations did King Edward the Confessor make, because I have a feeling that the charters were simply not preserved, and this decline is an illusion. Simply for you should really put it in the context. Imagine you're a Norman baron who came with William the Conqueror. You are taking this land. You're not interested in preserving the former charters because you're taking it not by the right of succession. You're taking it by the right of force or by the right of donation. And so these charters never got into the monastery archives because they were not of interest. And this is also very interesting for me to understand the relationship between, for example, the kings and the aristocracy. As we spoke of King Canute, we know, for example, that unfortunately it was not my discovery, but I highly subscribe to it. Catherine Mark in 1984 published a groundbreaking article where she calculated how many things witnessed King Ethelred's latest charters and how many things attested the charters of King Canute. And it seems there were only 20% of continuity. The personnel of the aristocracy was completely wiped out by King Sweyn's and King Canute's invasion. So yes, I do find them quite relevant, especially in the light of statistics.
And the second question, if I may, about the dynamics of production of these charters. Did you think about parallel movements in the production of charters and in the production and circulation of fine books, especially illustrated books? You know that in the period you are interested in, the Anglo-Saxon world produced a very original and inventive illusionistic style in painting, and it was really in advance to the rest of the West except the Ottonian court. There was nothing comparable in the quality, and probably the Pyrenean, the Beati or the Ivana manuscripts, but that's all. And we can find in the Anglo-Saxon history such moments, in chronological moments, and also territories where these fine illustrated treasure-like books in very sophisticated subjects were produced, and probably there is a correlation in these two movements, but it's just a kind of reflection of mine, probably on the track.
You're quite right. There is a correlation, although it might not be as straightforward as one might assume. The absolute record of the number of charters produced in one reign belongs to King Edgar, who over 16 years of his reign produced 164 charters alone, including the forgery. Including the contemporary forgeries and disputed charters. And we know that it coincided with the so-called the monastic Renaissance, when I'm not sure if it is the majority, but a great deal of the extant manuscripts were produced in the monasteries, naturally. But I do not myself go into the relationship between for example, the schools and the chancery. As I mentioned, for example, we know that the chancery existed, but we know it only using their byproducts in form of, for example, secondary documents and in different references scattered over the sources. So it's very difficult to establish this relationship, but there definitely must be something. It's not coming out of the blue. You cannot just create the documentary culture without having a good foundation. I agree.
We have time for one last question by Professor Bolzer.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much indeed. I feel myself very enlightened in this field. Thanks to your magnificent presentation and overview. My first question was what are particularities of your own view on these things, but I think you have begun already to answer it. I have, thanks to the question of Professor Moskobojnikov, and I have understood already that statistics play a great role in your own approach to this subject, but maybe you will add something more beyond the statistics. And I have, nevertheless, the second question also. It's a rather concrete, small question. It concerns this wonderful invocation in nomine eime et egia Sophia. Could you tell something more exactly about this particular form of invocation? Where, when, and why, and what sort of influences do you can